Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates. Lieutenant General H.S. Panag, former Northern Army commander, has come to be one of the most important commentators and thinkers of our time. He's also outspoken and pulls no punches when he writes and he speaks. His voice became a critical voice in the recent standoff between Indian and Chinese troops in the Galwan Valley, among other places in eastern Ladakh. His book of essays takes a look both back and ahead at the Indian Army. It covers a range of subjects from human rights to reforms that are needed in the military to, of course, the abiding romance of the uniform. General Panag is on the program with us now. Sir, congratulations on your book. You've always been a thinking soldier. But let me start by asking you something that I was discussing with another friend of mine who's a soldier this morning. And I asked him a question that I'll ask you. How do you find the military today different from, let's say, it was 20 years ago? Is it different or is it fundamentally the same?
I think within the units, at the grassroots, military is almost the same. Because it's like our regimental system is like one big family. And nothing much changes there, except the soldiers today are more aware. Most of them are social media savvy. Most of them have smartphones. They are fairly well paid. They have a reasonably good life. So there's a perceptible change in the kind of environment that prevails in terms of human resource. In our times, the minimum education qualification was 4th class. You know, a person could join after 4th class. And bulk of the recruits were 10th class and below. And today, most of them are, 10 plus 2, even higher categories. So soldiers are more aware and their training is much easier. And also this awareness also increases man management problems. So from simple soldiers, they have become aware, soldiers who are aware of their rights, so man management becomes a problem. So that is at the lower level. There's a perceptible change in the higher echelons. In the higher echelons, I think there has been a dilution of character, of leadership qualities, particularly as far as ethics and moral courage is concerned. This is perceptible because there are reports you are seeing all the time. Not that there was no corruption earlier. There is always marginal corruption because there are, bad pennies everywhere. Right. But it was very marginal. It was generally something to do with perks and privileges. But of late, in the last 15 odd years, there has been a quantum jump in the number of corruption cases, and this mostly involves the hierarchy of the army. So when I say moral courage, I also feel that I think we are not able to say what we should be saying in terms of the military advice that we give to the government or amongst ourselves. We more tend to toe the line or present a false picture of what the actual ground situation is.
So your book does have essays on what you call the politicization of the military. But let me ask you this, General Panag. You, by your critics, people who don't like what you have to say, have also been slaughtered as political. So today we have this unfortunate environment of public discourse where even among the military and the veterans, somebody is slaughtered as pro-BJP, somebody is slaughtered as anti-BJP. And you know that when you spoke your mind on China or you speak your mind on other issues, they'll say, हाँ ये तो है ही, ये जनरल साहब तो हैं ही उस तरफ है, ये तो उस तरफ के हैं, इनकी बेटी ने तो इलेक्शन लड़ा था, आम आदमी पार्टी के टिकट पे लड़ा था, ये तो वही कैंपेन करे थे, ये तो मोदी जी को पसंद ही नहीं करते. So you find, even though you're writing in your book about the politicization, that even you have been pulled into that politicization thappa, so to speak. So how do you respond to that?
You see, what has happened is that the military is an essential part of nationalism, as distinct from patriotism. Nationalism always identifies with a strong nation And I mean, they consider the nation must be very strong, and military is what makes the nation strong. So when ideologically we bend towards nationalism and it's a neo-nationalism, then the military gets sucked into it. So the military has become sort of part of every facet of national life. In everything we involve the military, and the distinction between the military and the government has also got blurred. Military is an organ of the state, and state is very, very distinct. Today, if you criticize the defense policy of the government, which logically any citizen should be criticizing, whether it's right or wrong, they say, okay, you're criticizing the army. So you are criticizing the political approach to, say, the way we handle this problem. Yeah. They say, oh, you don't trust your army. So that's one part. So this enmeshing of the military with nationalism and the blurring of the line between the military and the government is what causes all this.
Do you see yourself?
Now coming to this business about our side versus their side.
Yes.
I think this is because, see, it's like this, that if we said, for example, when we were dealing with Pakistan, in case of Pakistan, if you said, look, I don't think Pakistan has come across the LOC, or I don't think we are firing, we are exaggerating, then everybody would have pounced on us. No, you don't trust the soldiers, you don't trust what we are saying, and Pakistan is actually doing this, you are actually pro-Pakistan. Now today, there's a situation when China is inside our territory.
Yeah.
Now it's willy-nilly, it's known to everybody whether the government formally acknowledges it or not. Yet when you say, look, China has come out, we must do something about it, because the official line is that no, we are sort of going to sort it out diplomatically, and nobody has come inside. So again, you come under criticism that you are unnecessarily critical of the government. So I think this is actually what should I call? This is really being anti-national, because here is a situation where we are facing a rather grim situation on the LAC.
Yeah.
The enemy threatening us. It has massed its army. So have we. It has intruded into our territory, and we are actually into a denial mode. And those who are pointing it out are being criticized. I think this action of this actions of the majority, those who are sort of saying that nothing has happened, is anti-national.
But tell me this.
In my view.
Tell me this, when the Prime Minister went to address the troops in Ladakh, you were very, you were full of praise for that moment. You said this is something to welcome. Your critics online label you as a Modi critic. Do you see yourself as a Modi critic, or do you see yourself as a dispassionate veteran?
I don't think so. I think as far as leadership is concerned, I would say that Prime Minister Modi is probably more strong leader than probably some of our former prime ministers in terms of, I would say when you talk in terms of national security. So to that end, I would say that he has done a lot, but he's got his own compulsions in terms of the economy and how much of budget that he can allot to the military. To that extent, I personally am an admirer of Mr. Modi. What I am critical of...
I'm smiling because the trolls won't believe it. I'm smiling because the trolls won't believe it.
I am actually an admirer of his. See, what I am critical of is that if you must have a aggressive policy against, especially where our territorial integrity is concerned, whether it's Pakistan or whether it's China.
Sure.
I mean, I personally have no doubts about it. We simply cannot, territory is what defines a country, a nation, and we simply cannot,
compromise on
sort of allow anyone to encroach upon it at will.
Let me ask you let me ask you if you feel
I
vindicated.
just want to make one point about this.
Sure.
So I think I admire Mr. Modi for this, but where I am critical of him is that having if you want to adopt such a strong stand, and also in terms of territories that we have lost and which as per our parliament are ours, then you must reform and create a military that has the desired capability, which we have not done. To that end, how is it different from Prime Minister Nehru?
Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about China. You have now been on record. Actually, I remember our last interview, you said, I wish I were wrong. I wish I had not been vindicated. But today, when you look at the situation, there's an elaborate set of talks. The story has sort of faded off the headlines. There's a great opacity as to what actually is happening on the ground. You have said that we would need another division, an entire division to actually take on China militarily in the regions that we're talking about. What is your assessment of the latest situation on the ground?
I think China is basically, there has been certain amount of, what should I say, separation of the troops at the where they were in contact with each other in Galwan River Valley, where troops have gone back about 2 kilometers each, and the buffer zone, or the sort of what should I say, non-confrontation zone is about 4 kilometers. Now, similar action was to be taken at Pangong Tso. No action has been taken by the Chinese. Chinese are exactly where they were. That is at Finger 4. In Gogra and Hot Springs, they have not gone by the agreement fully. In Gogra, they have not pulled back. They have pulled back a little, but not to create a buffer zone of about 4 kilometers. And similarly, towards the north, in the area of Hot Springs, that's closer to Gogra, something similar has happened. They have not done it as per agreement. Now, Depsang is a big sort of question mark, because about Depsang intrusion, not much details are available. There have been reports where certain analysts have assessed that Indian Express, as well as Ajay Shukla has reported, and a number of others have reported, that the Chinese have come in 16 to 18 kilometers inside our territory in the area of Butse, that is between Butse and Kizil Jilga. That's the beginning of the Depsang Plains. Now, here, the Chinese have refused to talk about Depsang area. What appears to me is that the Chinese are going now, they have shelved the agreement of 1993. That is to maintain peace and tranquility on border agreement, which was there, which treated the LAC as per the positions which were occupied in 1993. But what China seems to be doing is that in those areas where it has not up to its 1959, 7th November 1959 claim line, it is also called 1960 claim line. It has come up to that claim line.
Yeah.
Because in fact, Finger 4 was approximate area, though they some say it is Finger 2, but Finger 4 was the area. In Depsang Plains, he has come up to the 1959 claim line. And similarly, the same situation in Hot Springs and all, he has even come beyond the 1959 claim line in Hot Springs and Gogra Post. So this is the current situation. And despite this, there has been no de-escalation of troops overall. And it's only the separation to avoid incidents. And China is exactly where it was. In fact, in the last meeting on 14th of July at the corps commander level, no headway was made. No headway was made. And after that, the China study group has met, and there has been no further diplomatic activity. And I would say that it is status quo prevails, and it is in favor of China. China is very much where it was. And it is looking at permanence, at least in Depsang Plains, definitely in Pangong Tso, and possibly some adjustment in the case of Hot Springs and Gogra.
So what are the options? So what are the options? If this is the case, sir, if this is the case, what are the options?
See, the first option should be diplomatic. If we can enforce, or we can finally our political aim is to get status quo anti-April 2020. If we can even compromise a little on it, that means we get this status quo, albeit with the buffer zones in the areas of conflict. Let's say a buffer zone between Finger 4 and 8, a buffer zone in Depsang Plains, a buffer zone in Hot Springs, Gogra, and in any case in Galwan, a buffer zone is already there. Chinese are on their side of the LAC in Galwan River Valley. So you can get that. I think it would be a good compromise. The Chinese haven't got hold of the territory that they wanted at the 1959 claim line, and they would go back on the understanding that buffer zones have been created. There'll be no further development of infrastructure or patrolling or deployment of troops. So that is so it's a compromise for both. But I put 3 riders on this solution. The rider number 1 is that the LAC must be demarcated. If the LAC is not demarcated, this agreement will also be
flouted.
Again be flouted, and they will come back again, buffer zone or no buffer zone. Number 2, I said that we must take the opposition. We must take the opposition and the parliament into confidence that this is the situation. This is what we have. This is what we have done. And thirdly, the Prime Minister must explain this situation to the nation. And I have no doubt that seeing the grim economic situation, the COVID problem that we are currently facing, and the military differential between India and China, we can certainly go for this kind of a compromise solution if it is feasible. But at the moment, there's an impasse. No headway is being made, and unless the level is raised, we raised it to the level of special representatives. Unless the level is further raised, let's say to the probably another summit meeting, etc., I don't think we are going to find this solution. Now that leaves us only with the military option.
Where you've actually where you've actually said there is no option because you need another division. That's actually what you've argued.
I don't know. Actually, we have already inducted enough troops. Normally, the Chinese and the LAC is looked after by 1 division of 14 corps. We have inducted 2 more divisions. So today there are actually 3 divisions inside in Eastern Ladakh. We have enough troops. Though ideally, if I have to, if there is a limited conflict or limited war, I would like that probably if I had a 4th division, I would be happy. What we may be short of is mechanized forces. But I'm sure they also have been inducted. I would probably want that we should have about 3 to 4 armored brigades available there, each with 2 armored regiments and 2 mechanized battalions. With this kind of a force, no matter whether China initiates, escalates the situation, and it attacks us, if we have to defend, then we'll be able to defend ourselves well and also go on a counteroffensive to gain equal amount of territory that China has captured, has taken of ours. And or if we feel that now there's no diplomatic solution and national honor demands that we must evict the Chinese, then we can also launch an offensive with this kind of a capability. Our Air Force is very capable. It can launch an air campaign separately and plus support the ground forces. I do not visualize naval involvement in any kind of a conflict at the moment for the simple reason, though we can warn Chinese shipping, but since the international shipping passes through the Indian Ocean and the Straits of Malacca, I don't think we can really go about blocking the Straits of Malacca and all, but we can take action against Chinese Navy or something in the
So I think this is going to take time to resolve. We don't have any immediate leads. Let's come back to the book. In the book, you look at Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan's role in it, but you also talk about human rights, and you have been part of a human rights group on Jammu and Kashmir that has just released a report, and it is talking about releasing political detainees. It is talking about restoring high-speed internet. It is talking about revoking the kind of media gag that exists de facto on the ground. General Panag, that image of that human shield, which is something that you've written about extensively and finds place in your book. And today, as a soldier, you serve in a human rights panel. Do you believe that you'll be attacked by your own for becoming a liberal human rights wala when you raise these issues? Because that is how polarized our discourse has become.
See, firstly, in my entire service of 40 years, I have never received a deliberate order that has asked me to do anything wrong. And if I have erred, it's because of my own judgment that I have erred. And neither have I ever issued any order to anybody. Anyone who supports that we should ride roughshod over the Kashmiris, or for that matter, anybody who the people where anybody is up in arms against in the Northeast, I would like to know that has he ever done it himself? Has he ever received orders to really ride roughshod over the general population? I don't think so. So why are we so emotional about what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir? I think the reason for that is that one is that, as I said again, nationalism, the way it has come, the way the nationalism has come center stage, and we have military operations in Jammu and Kashmir have got the entire nation has got emotionally involved with it.
Yeah.
Compared to what the situation was in 2001, you have yourself been covering it then,
yes.
Before
yes.
Kargil and after
yes.
Kargil.
Yes.
I think we peaked in sometimes in 2002, 2003 when 2,700 terrorists were killed in 1 year. That means the number of terrorists of 5,000, 6,000, 7,000. And
yeah.
today, the insurgency is very low, but the noise level is very high. So that is one part. So there is far too much of emotional involvement of the general public because of new nationals.
Yeah.
Number two, I think with Pakistan, the involvement there, and also because most of the terrorists, rather all of the terrorists in Kashmir, follow the followers of Islam. I think there's a latent kind of a feeling in India as a whole which prevails, that we were always subjugated by the invaders, and most of the invaders came outside, at least from somewhere around 1000 AD. They were always followers of Islam. I think this is an underlying thing that is there in everybody's mind. So this is so when a human right violation takes place, rather than look at it as a kind of a rogue action of the armed forces, we are more getting involved in it as us versus they, and that any sort of means justify the killing of the terrorists. I totally disagree with this. Moment an army starts behaving like the terrorists, it starts functioning like the terrorists, then it's no longer an organ of the state. It has become part. It's become another face of terrorism.
The human rights group that Radha Kumar helms and you are a member of, what would be the key points you'd like to highlight on the situation on the ground today?
I think one is that despite the fact that most of the restrictions which were imposed post 5 August have been lifted, yet there are a large number of people who are still under detention, including mainstream political leaders. There is a political vacuum that exists in Jammu and Kashmir, and whatever attempts were made, whether through the Sarpanches or through some other thing which seemed to be being sponsored by the intelligence agencies or by the government, I think they have miserably failed. So there is a need to fill this political void, and all the people who have been detained should be released. In any case, there have been no agitations. There has been there has been no quantum jump in insurgency as such. So why are we keeping those people detained? More so, the same people with whom you formed a government just about 2 years
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
Second part is that that one particular thing that is bothering everybody is this that because of COVID, there is schools and colleges have not been functioning. And 4G is essential for students to hold online classes. It's essential for Kashmiri business when they are dealing with whatever exports, the handicrafts and fruits, etc., that are coming on from there. And even I think yesterday again they have said that they are extending they will re-examine the 4G issue only after another 2 months. I think it is illogical, and whatever the claims that we all make that the terrorists use and misuse such things. I think it is just an excuse, because if they use it at the same time, you intercept their messages, and you also know how they are doing it. So if you don't have the technology and you can't do it, then the fault lies really with us. So this is the main thrust that
I hope someone is listening, because actually weakening the mainstream only strengthens the separatists, and this is the irony of what is happening in Kashmir and what we are doing. Finally, sir, your book has a number of rich personal anecdotes, historical anecdotes. It has the story of a soldier who falls in love with a Kashmiri girl and so on. But I want you to end with a personal anecdote, the story of how you encountered the man who would go on to become Pakistan's next air chief. I know you've written about that, and I think it would be an interesting story for our audience to hear. So please share that with our viewers.
Yeah. Yes, Barkha, I think it's a story that I have told many times, and I have written about it many times. The day was 22nd of December, 22nd of November. And most people think that the war began on 3rd of December, but actually we were in some sort of operational, conducting some operations right from the 10th of November. So on this day, my unit, as part of the division, had actually gone in on an offensive, and we were at a place called Chowgacha. That's about 10 to 15 kilometers from the international border from Boira. We were there was a river called the Kabdak River, and we were supposed to cross it. And south of us, some other units had gone across, namely 14 Punjab in the Garibpur area. So there was a battle going on. We were in contact with the enemy. We were across the border, and there was a major battle fought in the early hours of 22nd, when the forces at Garibpur were counterattacked by the Pakistanis. Anyway, to cut the long story short, we were continuously being strapped by air. Pakistan had one Sabre squadron in Dhaka, and they were flying from Dhaka, and they were carrying out strapping on us also and the other troops. And basically, what they would spot was there was a tank stuck on the bridge. They would try and go for that and other targets. So the time when was in the afternoon, I had gone to our real location where we echelons are located, and I was coming back when I saw that the Sabres were busy strapping, our positions up ahead of me, just about 3 kilometers. And suddenly I saw 4 more aircraft sort of fly over me and at treetop level. I thought that maybe another mission of Sabres, another mission of 4 Sabres has come. But then, as I was watching this thing, then the aircraft that went over my head, they peeled off, and they headed straight for the Sabres. The Sabres were busy, and they were doing high dives, that's going up and coming down in a sort of incline like this. And so they had no idea that this was happening. And then they were asked, this big aircraft were coming from the east, so rather from the west. Sun was setting. We were against the sun. So they were setting sun. They were coming along with, because in the east the sun sets early. So So 3 night aircraft took on three sabers, and they all were in flames in a matter of seconds, I think. Or the whole thing lasted about 30 to 40 seconds. This whole incident.
Yeah.
And 2 sort of canopies opened, and they were coming down. And 1 aircraft limped back towards Dhaka. So this aircraft, the canopy that one of the pilots that came down into our unit area. In the meantime, I had reached there. I was in a jeep, and I saw the troops had rushed towards that man. And sixth sense told me that maybe, since they were strapping us, and their pilot might get beaten up or even lynched. So I also ran towards this thing. And by the time I got to the pilot, so he had been already hit by the rifle butts by the soldiers, and they had surrounded him. So I literally had to actually lie over him, and then, so that the troops do not hit him anymore. He got badly hurt on his forehead. And then, of course, I calmed the troops down. I said, okay, whatever be it, he's a prisoner now, he'll give us more information. So then I brought him to the battalion headquarters, and I was the adjutant of the unit, so I had to carry out his interrogation. And he was a tall, 6 feet plus gentleman, very handsome, and very stoic, little shaken up, but very stoic. We dressed his wounds, gave him a cup of tea, and then I told him, I said, look, you are safe now. Nothing will to happen to you. We'll be sending you back soon. And I recorded his statement. There's an initial form that you fill up. His name was Pervez Qureshi Mehdi. And of course, I forgot about it. The unit still has the part of the ejection seat and what have you of the memorabilia. And we didn't have cameras those days. We didn't have mobile phones. So there's an odd picture lying in the unit, but I don't have one. But then years later, when I just read about it, that now the name was slightly, when I recorded the name, it was Pervez Qureshi Mehdi. So later on, he's also known as PQM, Pervez Qureshi Mehdi. But there was a little distortion. I think it became the word Pervez went into the center or something. There was a little change. There was a little confusion about the name as it is listed on the Wikipedia. But I came to know that there's a person by this name, and he has become the chief of Pakistan Air Force.
In Pakistan, yeah.
And so when I checked from the Wikipedia, we did find that he was a prisoner of war. Of course, the Air Force was aware of it because the Air Force prisoners had gone to Gwalior. That's where they were interrogated, and he had gone there. And I think these 2 pilots were repatriated earlier, because they were the only 2 pilots who were captured. I don't think any other pilot of Pakistan was captured by us in the East. And when Sam Manekshaw went back to Pakistan, even before the rest of the prisoners were repatriated, I think these 2 pilots were, at the time, handed back as a gesture of goodwill, and they went along with Sam in the same aircraft. Right. So then Pervez Qureshi Mehdi was the chief of Pakistani Air Force between 97 and 99, and that's the time you were covering Kargil. That time he was the air chief, right. And he was rather critical of the operation. This thing,
Musharraf's operation.
The way Musharraf had handled it. And he was sending his chief of staff and all to the briefing, but he was quite critical about it because they had not taken their PAF into confidence fully. So this is how the story is of how I captured the future air chief of Pakistan.
Fascinating. Many such more fascinating accounts in General Panag's book. Do pick up a copy. It is Reminiscences, Reform and Romance of the Indian Army. General Panag, pleasure as always talking to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Barkha.